Monica and Chandler's proposal is hailed as TV's perfect marriage. But the man kneeling on that floor wasn't crying tears of joy. He was quietly fighting for his life. Matthew Perry was physically crumbling from severe addiction, yet the executives at NBC refused to stop the cameras. NBC knew he was dying, but to protect their $1 million ad revenue, they simply disguised his withered, shaking body in oversized clothes. They forced a broken man to perform the happiest moment of his life while he was actively collapsing inside, leaving Courtney Cox to literally hold up her dying co-star. This is the cruel reality of how NBC tortured its own star. In 1994, the American television landscape was a monolithic cultural force. There were no streaming services, and the internet was in its infancy. If a network launched a successful primetime sitcom, it possessed a captive audience of 30 to 40 million people every single week. NBC was developing a new comedy about 6 20-somethings navigating life in New York City. The casting process was rigorous, searching for young actors who possessed sharp comedic timing and an undeniable immediate chemistry. When Courtney Cox walked onto the Warner Brothers lot, she was already the most established professional in the cast. She had gained significant national attention, dancing in a Bruce Springsteen music video and starring alongside Jim Carrey in the blockbuster film Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. The producers initially wanted her to play the spoiled runaway bride, Rachel Green. But Cox read the script and requested the role of Monica Geller instead. She saw something in the neurotic, highly organized, and intensely competitive chef. Cox herself was a grounded, fiercely professional actress who valued structure and preparation. She instinctively understood how to anchor a scene. Matthew Perry's entry into the production was entirely different. He was 24 years old, the youngest member of the core cast, and he was driven by a desperate, agonizing need for external validation. He had spent his early career bouncing between failed pilots, praying for a breakthrough. He was naturally gifted with a rapid-fire, sarcastic delivery, but that humor was not a trained acting technique. It was a psychological defense mechanism. Perry suffered from profound insecurity. He later admitted that he firmly believed fame would cure all of his internal pain. He wanted to be famous so badly that he would physically drop to his knees in his apartment and pray to whatever higher power would listen, offering to do anything if they would just make him a star. When he was finally cast as Chandler Bing, he infused the character with his own nervous energy. The sarcastic deflections, the specific cadence of his speech, and the desperate need to fill every silence with a joke were lifted directly from Perry's actual personality. He carried a terrifying internal rule onto the soundstage. If he delivered a joke and the live studio audience did not laugh, he felt physical panic. He tied his entire sense of human worth to the immediate audible approval of strangers. When the pilot for Friends aired in the autumn of 1994, the response was a cultural earthquake. The show did not just succeed, it exploded. Within a matter of months, the 6 unknown actors were transformed into the most recognizable human beings on the planet. The transition from civilian life to global superstardom was instantaneous and violent. They could no longer walk down the street, go to a grocery store, or sit in a restaurant without being mobbed. Paparazzi camped outside their homes. Every aspect of their physical appearance, Their romantic relationships and their daily habits became highly profitable fodder for the tabloid press. For Courtney Cox, the fame was a massive adjustment, but her ingrained professionalism and maturity helped her navigate the chaos. She naturally assumed a maternal organizing role within the cast. She encouraged the 6 actors to band together, establishing a united front during contract negotiations, and ensuring they all supported one another during the grueling 24-episode shooting schedules. For Matthew Perry, the fame was a catastrophic shock to his system. He got exactly what he had prayed for, but he quickly realized the terrifying truth. The global adoration did not fix his internal emptiness. The millions of dollars in the magazine covers did not cure his anxiety. Instead, the pressure magnified it. He was now expected to be universally funny on command week after week, with 30 million people scrutinizing his every movement. The pressure to maintain the high-energy, sarcastic persona of Chandler Bing became a heavy, suffocating coat that he could not take off. The turning point occurred in 1997 during the filming of a movie in Nevada. Perry was involved in a jet ski accident on Lake Mead. He was treated by a doctor for the resulting pain and handed a prescription for a mild opiate. When he swallowed that first pill, a profound and deadly shift occurred in his brain chemistry. The medication did not merely numb the physical ache in his back, it silenced the deafening noise in his head. For the first time in his adult life, the crushing anxiety, the fear of not being funny enough, and the overwhelming pressure of his unprecedented fame completely vanished. He felt a warm, terrifyingly perfect sense of peace. He returned to the set of Friends carrying a new, deeply guarded secret. The television industry demands absolute consistency from its performers. The lighting must be identical, the comedic timing must be sharp, and the actors must hit their marks with military precision. Perry began utilizing the prescription pills to cope with the relentless, grinding schedule of the production. Initially, it was a quiet, invisible dependency. He would arrive on the Warner Brothers lot, deliver his lines, and retreat to his dressing room. But addiction is a progressive, ravenous disease. It requires a constantly escalating chemical dosage to maintain the same baseline of relief. The single pill quickly turned into 5, then 10, and the baseline shifted from managing pain to simply surviving the day. He began doctor shopping, manipulating medical professionals across Los Angeles to secure multiple prescriptions. The man who was responsible for delivering the sharpest comedic punchlines on network television was quietly embarking on a descent into severe chemical dependency, completely unaware that his private coping mechanism was about to collide violently with the most demanding, high-profile storyline of his entire career. As the 4th season of the program approached its finale in early 1998, the writers were preparing to send the cast to England to film a special 2-part episode. The narrative focus was entirely centered on the wedding of another character. However, the producers felt they needed a brief, shocking moment of comic relief to break up the dramatic tension of the episode. They decided to put the characters of Monica and Chandler into a hotel room together. It was a logistical writing decision. There was no grand master plan for a long-term romance. It was intended to be a drunken mistake, a brief, embarrassing anomaly between two friends that would be laughed at and swiftly swept under the rug when the characters returned to New York. The cast boarded the plane to London to film the finale. Courtney Cox prepared to execute the comedic beats of the scene with her usual precision. Matthew Perry packed his luggage, ensuring he had enough pills to survive the overseas flight and the intense production schedule. Neither of them knew that the scene they were about to film would trigger an unprecedented audience reaction, permanently altering the trajectory of the series and trapping a dying man in a highly publicized television romance. The journey to London in the spring of 1998 was intended to be a logistical triumph for the NBC broadcasting network. Taking a massive multi-camera American sitcom overseas to film a two-part season finale was a highly expensive, heavily publicized corporate event. The narrative was focused on the wedding of Ross Geller, and the entire production apparatus was geared towards executing that specific storyline. Courtney Cox and Matthew Perry were assigned a secondary subplot. The script dictated a moment of drunken vulnerability where Monica, feeling profoundly insecure about her own romantic life, seeks comfort in Chandler's hotel room. It was written as a brief transactional gag. The writers assumed the audience would laugh at the sheer absurdity of the pairing, and the characters would return to New York and awkwardly pretend it never happened. The production set up inside the Fountain Studios in Wembley, London. A live audience of British fans was brought in for the taping. The cameras rolled, the dialogue was delivered, and the scene transitioned to the following morning. When the actor playing Ross entered the hotel room, Chandler appeared flustered. A few seconds later, Monica abruptly popped her head out from underneath the duvet. What happened next fundamentally altered the course of American television history. The studio audience did not just laugh at a punchline. They erupted into a massive, sustained, and deafening roar of approval. The cheering was so intense and relentless that it physically halted the production. The actors were forced to hold their frozen comedic expressions for 27 seconds while the crowd screamed. In the control room, the creators and producers looked at the monitors in absolute shock. They had not written a romance. They had written a throwaway joke. But the audience reaction was an undeniable, visceral demand. The television industry operates on a ruthless metric of audience engagement, and the network executives immediately recognized a goldmine. The chemistry between Cox's highly strung type A chef and Perry's deeply insecure, sarcastic executive was a perfect, untested formula. Before the cast even boarded the return flight to Los Angeles, the corporate directive was issued. The trajectory of the series was permanently changed. The accidental one-night stand was to be transformed into a secret, long-term relationship. Monica and Chandler would become the central romantic anchor designed to drive the ratings for the entire 5th season and beyond. While this pivot secured the financial supremacy of the network, it placed an unimaginable crushing weight directly onto Matthew Perry. The transition into the 5th season required intense, highly physical comedic scene work. The secret relationship storyline meant that Cox and Perry were suddenly sharing the majority of their screen time. They had to execute complex, fast-paced dialogue, physical comedy, and deep emotional beats, all while hitting their tape marks with absolute precision to satisfy the multi-camera format. For Courtney Cox, this elevated workload was an exciting professional challenge. For Matthew Perry, it was an accelerating nightmare. By the time the cameras began rolling on the new season in late 1998, the chemical dependency that had begun with a jet ski accident had mutated into a catastrophic, full-blown addiction. The pressure of being half of the most famous couple on television drove his anxiety to unmanageable levels. He was no longer using prescription painkillers to manage a physical injury. He was consuming them in massive quantities to survive the psychological terror of his own fame. His daily intake reached terrifying proportions. At his absolute lowest point during this era, he was consuming up to 55 Vicodin pills a single day. A human liver is not designed to process that level of toxicity. To compound the danger, he began attempting to regulate the manic, terrifying side effects of the opiates by consuming vast quantities of alcohol. He was drinking a quart of vodka a day to force himself to sleep and waking up to consume dozens of pills just to find the energy to drive to the Warner Brothers studio lot. He was existing in a permanent, harrowing state of intoxication or agonizing withdrawal. The physical deterioration of the leading man became impossible to ignore, serving as a highly visible public timeline of his internal battle. Because Friends is heavily syndicated and endlessly rewatched, modern viewers can clearly track the devastating trajectory of his illness. Within the span of a single season, his weight fluctuated violently. He would drop to dangerously thin, emaciated levels, his clothing hanging loosely off his skeletal frame. Months later, the alcohol abuse would cause his weight to wildly rebound, leaving him bloated and heavily sweating under the studio lights. The cruel reality of a sitcom set is that there is nowhere to hide. The brightly lit soundstage exposes every physical flaw. The directors, producers, and network executives were not ignorant of his severe medical crisis. They were highly trained professionals who worked intimately with the cast every single day. They saw his trembling hands. They noticed the sickly gray pallor of his skin and the glazed, unfocused look in his eyes during morning table reads. There were quiet, tense conversations behind closed doors. The cast members, who viewed each other as a tightly knit family, attempted private interventions, pleading with him to seek help. But the merciless rules of 1990s television broadcasting dictated the outcome. The actor was, first and foremost, highly valuable corporate property. The Monica and Chandler romance was generating record-breaking viewership numbers. The advertising blocks sold during their episodes were commanding premium astronomical prices. Halting a massive production to send the male lead to an extended necessary medical rehabilitation facility would cost the studio millions of dollars in delayed production and lost revenue. The business logic operating at the highest levels of the network was clinical and absolute. The show could not stop, and the jokes must be delivered on schedule. Instead of intervening to save his biological life, the studio apparatus employed a strategy of visual concealment. They treated his near-fatal addiction as a cosmetic issue. The network executives issued orders to the wardrobe and makeup departments. When his weight plummeted to terrifying levels, he was dressed in multiple layers of oversized, baggy clothing to artificially bulk up his frame and hide his emaciation from the cameras. When his complexion revealed the toxic damage to his liver, the makeup artists applied heavy contouring and bronzer to manufacture the illusion of a healthy, vibrant young man. The system made a deliberate, calculated choice to extract his comedic value until the very last drop, prioritizing the production schedule over his basic human survival. Because the studio completely abdicated its moral responsibility to halt the production, the daily grinding burden of managing his severe illness fell directly onto his primary scene partner. Courtney Cox was suddenly forced into the role of a stealth caregiver. The mechanics of performing a live audience sitcom rely entirely on rhythm, trust, and timing. A joke only lands if the setup and the punchline are delivered with synchronized energy. During the seasons where their romance became the central pillar of the show, Perry was frequently fighting for his life on the set. There were scenes where he was visibly sweating, his hands shaking so violently from opiate withdrawal that he had to hide them in his pockets. There were days when his mind was so clouded by the massive quantities of narcotics he had consumed that he simply could not focus, causing him to drop his cues or forget his lines entirely. Courtney Cox did not complain to the press. She did not halt the taping to demand a more reliable scene partner. Instead, she became his uncredited silent anchor. During those excruciatingly tense tapings, she had to physically and emotionally guide him through the takes. She constantly, seamlessly adjusted her own comedic timing to cover his mistakes. If he missed a cue, she would wait an extra, agonizing beat before delivering her line, ensuring the rhythm of the scene was not completely destroyed. She used subtle physical contact, a hand on his arm, a firm grip on his shoulder, to ground him and keep him present when his eyes began to glaze over. She was working twice as hard as anyone else on that soundstage. She had to carry the emotional weight of a highly scrutinized, globally beloved romance, ensuring her own performance remained flawless, while simultaneously acting as a human safety net for her co-star. She had to project the illusion of a blissful, deeply connected couple, smiling warmly into the eyes of a man she knew was actively dying inside, all while the studio cameras coldly recorded the entire ordeal for global distribution. As the 5th season of the series progressed through the winter of 1998 and into the spring of 1999, the writers struck comedic gold by weaponizing the secret of Monica and Chandler's relationship. The narrative required the two characters to frantically hide their romance from their closest friends, leading to increasingly absurd and highly physical comedic situations. This storyline produced some of the most celebrated and highly rated episodes in the history of television broadcasting. But the physical demands of this specific narrative arc placed an excruciating strain on a man whose biological systems were actively beginning to shut down. To perform physical comedy, to dive behind couches, to sprint into bedrooms, to deliver rapid-fire, panicked dialogue requires immense stamina, sharp reflexes, and acute mental clarity. Matthew Perry possessed none of these things. His addiction to opiates and alcohol had reached a critical systemic level. He was no longer simply self-medicating for anxiety. He was trapped in a grueling daily physiological battle to prevent severe withdrawal. The cognitive dissonance of his daily existence was staggering. He was being paid millions of dollars to portray a man experiencing the thrilling, chaotic joy of a new, passionate romance, while his actual reality was defined by profound isolation, physical sickness, and a terrifying loss of control. The peak of this specific storyline arrived with the episode where the entire cast finally discovers the relationship. It required Perry to perform a high-energy, escalating game of psychological chicken with his co-stars, culminating in the moment where his character breaks down and publicly screams that he is in love with Monica. The studio audience roared with approval. The critics praised his impeccable comedic timing. But to watch that scene with the historical knowledge of his condition is a deeply sobering experience. The frantic energy he projected on screen was not entirely acting. It was the frantic, desperate energy of a man operating on the absolute razor's edge of human endurance, heavily intoxicated, sweating under the studio lights, and clinging to the script as his only tether to reality. As the series transitioned into its 6th season in the autumn of 1999, the dynamic of the show fundamentally shifted. The secret was out. Monica and Chandler moved in together. The writers transitioned the characters from a frantic hidden romance into a grounded domestic partnership. This narrative evolution required a softer, more nuanced, and emotionally vulnerable performance from the actors. They were no longer relying on slammed doors and hiding under beds for laughs. They had to portray a mature couple navigating the quiet, daily realities of commitment. This requirement for grounded emotional intimacy on camera highlighted the stark, agonizing contrast between the fictional Chandler Bing and the real Matthew Perry. Chandler was healing. The character was shedding his deep-seated commitment issues, learning to trust and allowing himself to be loved by a stable, organized woman. Matthew Perry, conversely, was entirely incapable of healing. He was incapable of committing to his own survival. He was playing a man finding his soulmate, while his own soul was being methodically eroded by a daily intake of Vicodin and a quart of vodka. Courtney Cox recognized this profound disconnect, and she quietly adjusted her entire professional approach to accommodate it. Because the characters were now living together, her screen time with Perry increased exponentially. They were sharing the majority of their scenes in the confined space of the apartment set. Cox, who naturally thrived on structure and meticulous preparation, became the absolute gravitational center of their working relationship. She understood that Perry's memory was severely compromised by the narcotics. Memorizing the weekly scripts, which were constantly being rewritten by the producers right up until the night of the taping, is a difficult task for a healthy actor. For a man whose brain chemistry was heavily suppressed by downers, it was nearly impossible. Cox took it upon herself to master not only her own dialogue, but his as well. During the grueling rehearsal days, she would patiently run lines with him over and over again, helping him find the rhythm of the new scenes. When they stepped in front of the live studio audience, she acted as his subtle, invisible conductor. She learned to read his physical cues with microscopic precision. If she saw his eyes lose their focus, or if she felt the slight tremor in his hand that signaled an impending mental blank, she would subtly shift her blocking, step into his eye line, and deliver her line with a specific grounding inflection designed to pull him back into the present moment. She provided the stability on screen that he so desperately lacked in his private life. But the human body can only withstand a massive chemical assault for a finite period before a catastrophic biological failure occurs. For Matthew Perry, that failure arrived in the early months of the year 2000. The severe, sustained abuse of alcohol and prescription medication triggered a life-threatening medical emergency. He was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles and diagnosed with pancreatitis. This is not a mild illness. Pancreatitis is a severe, excruciatingly painful inflammation of the pancreas, frequently caused by extreme chronic alcoholism. The digestive enzymes activate while still inside the organ, effectively causing the pancreas to begin digesting itself. It is a terrifying, potentially fatal condition that requires immediate, intense medical intervention. Perry spent weeks in the hospital. He was completely incapacitated, surviving on intravenous fluids, heavily medicated for the agonizing pain, and forced to confront the absolute devastation he had inflicted upon his own body. He was hovering on the brink of death. In any other professional environment, the hospitalization of a key employee with a life-threatening illness would prompt a full cessation of duties and a mandatory extended period of medical leave. But the Hollywood studio system does not operate on empathy. It operates on broadcasting schedules and advertising contracts. The sixth season of Friends was barreling toward its highly anticipated finale. The writers had already mapped out the culmination of the 2-year romantic arc. The season was designed to end with Chandler Bing proposing to Monica Geller. It was the most important television event of the year, guaranteed to draw tens of millions of viewers and secure astronomical commercial rates. The network executives and producers viewed Perry's hospitalization not as a human tragedy, but as a severe logistical crisis. They scrambled to rewrite scenes, shooting around his absence for a brief period. But the finale was approaching. They needed their leading man back on the soundstage. The corporate pressure exerted upon him to return to work was immense. He was discharged from the hospital and immediately thrust back into the relentless machinery of the Warner Brothers lot. He returned to the set physically hollowed out. The pancreatitis and the inability to consume solid food for weeks had caused him to lose over 20 pounds from an already fragile frame. He looked drastically, shockingly different. His face was gaunt, his clothing hung off him like a skeleton, and he moved with the slow, careful fragility of a man who had just survived a major biological trauma. The studio apparatus immediately deployed its visual countermeasures. The wardrobe department enveloped him in oversized, dark clothing. The makeup artist worked aggressively to add color to his pale, drawn face. The network was preparing to film the most romantic, joyful scene in the history of the series, and they were going to do it with a man who could barely stand under his own power. The filming of the 2-part finale, the one with the proposal, took place in May 2000. The set decorators transformed Monica's apartment into a breathtaking visual spectacle. They extinguished the harsh studio lighting and filled the set with hundreds of lit candles, creating a warm, golden, intensely intimate atmosphere. But the physical reality of the soundstage was sweltering. The heat generated by hundreds of open flames, combined with the heavy dark clothing Perry was forced to wear to hide his weight loss, created a physically oppressive environment. When the director called for action on the final scene, the live studio audience fell into a dead, reverent silence. Courtney Cox walked into the candlelit room. The script dictated that the proposal would be a subversion of traditional gender roles, an emotional climax where both characters express their profound vulnerability. Cox dropped to her knees first. It was a beautiful narrative choice, but practically, it was also an essential grounding mechanism. By taking control of the physical space, she anchored the scene. She set the emotional pace. Perry, frail, exhausted, and heavily traumatized by his recent hospitalization, dropped to his knees to join her. The cameras rolled closely on their faces. Perry began to deliver his dialogue. "I thought that it mattered what I said or where I said it," he whispered. "Then I realized the only thing that matters is that you make me happier than I ever thought I could be." Tears streamed down both of their faces. The audience wept. The directors in the control booth celebrated. It was universally hailed as a masterclass in television acting, a flawless execution of emotional vulnerability. But when you strip away the romantic context and examine the cold historical reality of that specific moment in time, the scene takes on a deeply harrowing dimension. The cameras did not capture a man stepping joyfully into his future. They captured a man barely surviving his present. The tears in Matthew Perry's eyes were not simply the result of brilliant acting. They were the physical manifestation of absolute, overwhelming exhaustion. He was a man who had nearly died in a hospital bed just weeks prior, forced to kneel in a sweltering candlelit room and perform the ultimate expression of human happiness for a network that refused to let him rest. And directly across from him, holding his hands, was Courtney Cox. The tears she shed on screen were real. She was looking into the hollowed, gaunt face of a close friend she had spent 2 years desperately trying to protect. She had managed his missed cues, covered his physical tremors, and carried the comedic rhythm of their scenes while he battled a relentless addiction. Now she was physically holding on to him as he delivered the climax of their shared storyline. She was the silent, uncredited structural support beam that prevented the entire multi-million-dollar scene from collapsing into tragedy. The executives at NBC and Warner Brothers got exactly what they demanded. The episode aired to staggering record-breaking numbers. The proposal cemented the series as the undisputed king of network television. The studio successfully monetized a fairy tale, entirely ignoring the grim, terrifying reality required to produce it. They captured the perfect illusion of love, completely blind to the fact that the most profound act of devotion in that room was not written in the script. It was the quiet, determined professionalism of an actress who refused to let her co-star fall apart in front of 30 million people. The proposal had secured the immediate future of the television network, but it did absolutely nothing to secure the survival of the man who had delivered it. When the cameras stopped rolling on the 6th season finale in the spring of 2000, the crew dismantled the candlelit set, the executives celebrated their ratings, and the cast dispersed for their summer hiatus. The public assumption, fueled by the aggressive public relations machinery of the studio, was that Matthew Perry had suffered a severe, isolated medical scare with his pancreas, but had ultimately recovered. The narrative sold to the press was one of triumph. The resilient actor had bounced back just in time to give the world the television romance it so desperately craved. But behind the locked doors of his private life, the reality was a terrifying, accelerating freefall. The hospitalization for pancreatitis had not cured his addiction. It had merely forced a brief, agonizing pause in his consumption of alcohol. The underlying psychological architecture that drove his need to self-medicate, the crushing insecurity, the desperate need for external validation, and the suffocating pressure of his unprecedented global fame remained entirely unaddressed. As the summer of 2000 bled into autumn, the cast was legally obligated to return to the Warner Brothers lot to commence filming the 7th season. The writers had crafted a premiere episode that picked up on the exact same night as the proposal. It was meant to be a seamless narrative continuation, a joyful celebration of the newly engaged couple. However, the physical reality of the actors shattered this illusion entirely. When viewers eventually watched the season 7 premiere, titled The One with Monica's Thunder, they were confronted with one of the most jarring, undeniable visual discrepancies in television history. Because the episodes were filmed months apart, the physical toll of Perry's ongoing deterioration was impossible to hide. In the final scene of season 6, he was wearing a specific shirt, his face gaunt from his recent hospitalization. In the opening scene of season 7, supposedly taking place mere minutes later in the timeline of the show, he was wearing the exact same shirt, but his physical appearance had drastically, violently changed. His weight had plummeted even further. He looked frail, exhausted, and visibly ill. The studio executives, the directors, and the writers saw this glaring continuity error in the editing room. They saw the undeniable physical evidence that their leading man was actively withering away. But the corporate mandate remained absolute. They did not halt the broadcast. They did not issue a statement of concern. They simply aired the episode, relying on the audience's devotion to the characters to blind them to the suffering of the actor. The machine required content, and the biological reality of the human being providing that content was treated as a completely irrelevant variable. To navigate the grueling 24-episode schedule of the 7th season, the writers made a brilliant, highly pragmatic structural decision. The entire narrative arc of the season was dedicated to the logistics of planning Monica and Chandler's wedding. To drive the comedy, the writers leaned heavily into the established traits of Courtney Cox's character. Monica was written as the hyper-organized, obsessive, intensely demanding bride-to-be. She took complete control of the wedding planning, micromanaging every detail from the invitations to the catering. From a narrative perspective, it was hilarious and entirely consistent with her character. But from a practical, behind-the-scenes standpoint, it was a vital survival mechanism for the production. By making Monica the frantic driving force of the storyline, the writers allowed Chandler to become the passive, overwhelmed, and frequently exhausted partner. He was given fewer physically demanding comedic set pieces. He was allowed to sit on the couch while Monica paced the apartment. This dynamic was not just good writing, it was a highly effective cover-up. It meant that Courtney Cox was officially carrying the entire energetic frequency of their pairing. She stepped onto the soundstage every week knowing that the success of the episode rested squarely on her shoulders. She delivered the high-energy, fast-paced dialogue required to keep the studio audience engaged while seamlessly covering for Perry's lack of stamina. When he delivered his lines with a low, exhausted monotone, it was framed within the context of the show, as Chandler simply being tired of talking about floral arrangements. In reality, it was Matthew Perry barely possessing the physical strength to speak. Cox became the protective shield, taking the comedic heavy lifting so her scene partner could simply survive the taping. But the Hollywood system is inherently greedy. It does not merely demand the time you have contracted. It actively encourages you to sell whatever time you have left. Despite struggling to survive the weekly schedule of a network sitcom, Perry was offered a leading role in a major motion picture, Serving Sarah. Driven by the relentless, deeply ingrained fear that his fame was fragile and could disappear at any moment, he accepted the role. This decision was a catastrophic error. It required him to fly back and forth between Los Angeles, where he was filming Friends, and Dallas, Texas, where the movie was being shot. The human body is not designed to withstand a punishing dual production schedule across multiple time zones, let alone a body that has been systematically ravaged by years of severe chemical dependency. By February 2001, the structural integrity of his life completely collapsed. The grueling travel schedule, the lack of sleep, and the immense pressure of carrying a film while simultaneously anchoring a network television wedding fractured his fragile grip on sobriety. To cope with the overwhelming physical and mental exhaustion, he turned to a terrifying combination of substances. He began consuming massive quantities of vodka, chased with methadone, a highly potent synthetic opioid typically used in controlled settings to treat severe heroin addiction. He was alone in a hotel room in Dallas. He was sweating profusely, shaking violently, and his internal organs were warning him of an imminent fatal shutdown. He had reached the absolute, undeniable bottom of the abyss. For the first time in his entire career, the terrifying reality of his impending death finally eclipsed his desperate need for public validation. He picked up the phone and made a desperate, agonizing call to his parents, begging them for help. His parents immediately flew to Dallas, packed his belongings, and pulled him out of the movie production. He was transported to a highly secure rehabilitation facility. The man who was scheduled to film the most anticipated television wedding of the decade was now locked inside a medical treatment center, fighting severe withdrawal and attempting to rebuild his shattered psychological foundation. When the news of his admittance into rehab reached the executive offices of NBC and Warner Brothers, the reaction was not one of profound empathy. It was a state of absolute, unadulterated corporate panic. The timing was disastrous for the network. It was the spring of 2001. The two-part season finale, the one with Monica and Chandler's wedding, was just weeks away from filming. This was the anchor of the May sweeps period, the critical window where television networks set their advertising rates for the entire following year based on viewership numbers. Millions of dollars in guaranteed revenue had already been secured based on the promise of this specific wedding episode. The writers and producers convened emergency meetings. They could not delay the broadcast. They could not write him out of his own wedding. The entire marketing apparatus of the network had been promoting this event for months. They were forced to confront an impossible logistical nightmare. How do you film a joyful, highly romantic television wedding when the groom is currently a patient in a lockdown rehabilitation facility? The solution they devised stands as one of the most chilling examples of industry pragmatism in the history of entertainment. They did not halt the production. Instead, they negotiated an arrangement with the medical facility. The writers quickly drafted a brilliant, highly convenient subplot for the finale. Chandler, overwhelmed by the pressure of commitment, gets cold feet and runs away on the eve of his wedding, forcing the rest of the cast to frantically search for him. This storyline was hailed by critics as a hilarious, tense narrative twist that perfectly fit the character's long-standing fear of commitment. But in reality, it was a cold, calculated logistical maneuver. By writing Chandler out of the first half of the finale, the producers significantly reduced Perry's required time on set. They effectively monetized his actual disappearance into rehab by mirroring it in the script. When it came time to film the actual ceremony, the arrangement became incredibly surreal. Matthew Perry did not drive himself to work from a comfortable Hollywood home. He was driven to the Warner Brothers lot in a highly controlled transport directly from the rehabilitation center. He was accompanied at all times by a sober technician, a medical professional whose sole responsibility was to ensure the actor did not relapse or collapse while on studio property. The set of the wedding was stunning. The art department had constructed a beautiful romantic hall. Courtney Cox was dressed in a pristine, custom-made bridal gown. The supporting cast was in formal wear. The studio audience, entirely unaware of the grim mechanics operating behind the scenes, was buzzing with excitement. Perry was led out of his dressing room, dressed in a tailored tuxedo. He hit his mark at the altar. The director called for action. The vows they exchanged on screen are legendary. Chandler looked into Monica's eyes and delivered a monologue about finding his true partner, about overcoming his fears, and about stepping into a beautiful shared future. The audience wept. It was the definitive, triumphant culmination of a 2-year storyline. But the stark, unvarnished reality of that specific moment is profoundly disturbing. The man delivering those vows of eternal happiness was not celebrating a personal victory. He was a patient on day release from a medical facility. He was raw, terrified, and newly sober, his nervous system screaming in the absence of the heavy narcotics he had relied upon for years. When the director yelled, "Cut," he did not go out to celebrate with his castmates. He took off the tuxedo, got back into the transport vehicle with his sober companion, and was driven back to a sterile room in a rehab clinic to sleep. Through it all, Courtney Cox stood directly across from him at that altar. When she looked into his eyes and delivered her vows, she was entirely aware of the terrifying reality he was living. She knew about the methadone, the hotel room in Dallas, and the sober technician waiting just off camera. Once again, she was required to project the absolute pinnacle of romantic joy while serving as the emotional anchor for a man who was fighting a brutal war for his basic survival. She maintained the illusion with absolute, unwavering professionalism. The network broadcast the 2-part wedding episode in May 2001. Nearly 30 million people tuned in. It was a staggering commercial success. The executives at NBC secured their advertising rates. The producers were lauded for their brilliant storytelling. And the tabloids celebrated the fictional union of television's favorite couple. The Hollywood machine had successfully extracted the necessary emotional labor from a broken man, perfectly packaging his trauma into a highly profitable, sanitized hour of family entertainment. The cameras stopped rolling on the season 7 wedding, and the newly sober actor was driven back to his treatment facility. But the reality of a television contract is that there is always another season. When the cast reunited in the late summer of 2001 to begin filming the 8th season of Friends, The dynamic on the Warner Brothers lot had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. Matthew Perry walked onto stage 24 without the chemical shield he had relied upon for the entirety of his adult professional life. He was completely, terrifyingly sober. To the general public, sobriety is often framed as a triumphant finish line. In the brutal reality of addiction recovery, it is merely the starting gun for a profoundly painful psychological reckoning. For years, Perry had utilized massive quantities of alcohol and prescription opiates to mute his crippling insecurities and silence the deafening roar of his own anxiety. Now the volume was turned all the way up. The harsh, sweltering studio lights felt blinding. The noise of the live studio audience was no longer a validation of his existence. It was a terrifying, overwhelming pressure. He was a man who had built a global comedic empire while heavily sedated, and he was suddenly forced to confront a horrifying question. Did he actually know how to be funny without the drugs? He had to completely relearn how to perform. The rapid-fire, sarcastic cadence of Chandler Bing had been fueled by a manic chemical energy. Without the Vicodin, his natural rhythm was slower, more deliberate, and far more vulnerable. He was hyper-aware of his own body, stripped of the numbing agent that had allowed him to effortlessly deliver punchlines while his internal organs were failing. The actor was an exposed nerve, terrified that the network executives, the writers, and the 30 million viewers would suddenly realize he was a fraud. This is where the true depth of Courtney Cox's partnership manifested. During the darkest days of the production, she had acted as a stealth caregiver, physically guiding a dying man through his scenes. Now her role shifted from crisis management to nurturing a fragile, terrified artist. She understood that he no longer needed someone to hide his physical tremors. He needed someone to rebuild his shattered confidence. Cox adapted to the new Matthew Perry with the same meticulous professionalism she applied to every script. She recognized that his timing had changed. The manic pacing was gone, replaced by a softer, more grounded delivery. Instead of trying to force him back into the frantic rhythm of the earlier seasons, she adjusted Monica's energy to meet him where he was. She gave him the necessary space to find his footing within a scene. When he hesitated, unsure of a comedic beat, she would hold her reaction, allowing him the extra fraction of a second he needed to land the joke. She provided a safe, unwavering foundation on the soundstage, silently assuring him that he did not need a chemical substance to be brilliant. As the 8th season progressed, the cultural context of the program shifted dramatically. Following the tragedies of September 11th, 2001, the American public retreated to the safety of their living rooms. They desperately sought comfort, familiarity, and a world where problems were easily resolved. Friends became a national security blanket. The viewership numbers surged to astronomical heights. The program was no longer just a hit sitcom. It was a psychological necessity for a traumatized nation. This surge in popularity meant that the corporate pressure exerted by NBC and Warner Brothers reached its absolute zenith. The advertising rates were higher than ever before, and the studio executives demanded flawless execution. They required the actors to deliver pristine, joyful entertainment, completely ignoring the fact that the man providing the primary comedic relief was fighting a grueling daily battle to rewire his own traumatized brain. The Hollywood machine simply did not care about the difficulty of his recovery. They only cared that the product was delivered on schedule. The writers, recognizing the maturation of the characters and perhaps inadvertently mirroring the newly grounded reality of the actors, steered Monica and Chandler into a deeply emotional storyline for the final 2 seasons. The couple discovers they are facing severe infertility issues. The manic, secretive romance of the earlier years was replaced by a mature, painful struggle to start a family. They navigate the heartbreak of failed treatments and ultimately decide to pursue adoption. This specific narrative arc required a level of emotional depth and sincerity that transcended standard sitcom fare. For Perry, playing a man desperate to become a father carried a heavy, unspoken irony. The addiction that had consumed his 20s and early 30s had robbed him of the normal timeline of human development. While his peers were getting married and starting actual families, he had been fighting for his life in hospital beds and rehabilitation centers. He was acting out the beautiful domestic future he had always wanted, while acutely aware that the wreckage of his own past had made that reality incredibly difficult to achieve in his private life. When Chandler and Monica finally receive the call that a pregnant woman in Ohio has chosen them to adopt her child, the script required Perry to deliver an impassioned plea to the birth mother. He looks directly at the actress and says, "My wife is already there. She is a mother without a baby. Please." It is one of the most devastatingly earnest moments in the entire 10-year run of the series. The vulnerability Perry projected on screen was not a manufactured television emotion. It was the raw, unvarnished truth of a man who had been stripped down to his absolute core. He was channeling his own profound understanding of longing, inadequacy, and the desperate desire to be worthy of love. And once again, Courtney Cox was standing right next to him, absorbing that emotion, reflecting it back to the cameras, and anchoring the scene with absolute unwavering support. The relentless machinery of the network television schedule eventually grinds to a halt. By early 2004, the cast had negotiated the end of the series. They were earning an unprecedented $1 million per episode, but they were also creatively and physically exhausted. The studio prepared to film the 2-part series finale. The corporate apparatus went into overdrive, marketing the conclusion as the ultimate television event of the decade. Commercial slots during the broadcast were sold for millions of dollars. The executives were preparing for their final massive payday. The atmosphere on stage 24 during the final weeks of filming was thick with grief. The 6 actors were preparing to walk away from the defining experience of their lives. For Matthew Perry, the finale represented a terrifying cliff edge. Friends had been the source of his greatest trauma, the catalyst for his near-fatal addiction, and the mechanism of his deepest public humiliation. But it had also been his daily structure. It was the place where he was forced to show up, hit his marks, and interact with the people who had saved his life. He was about to lose the golden handcuffs, but he was also about to lose his sanctuary. The final scene of the series was filmed in the empty shell of Monica's apartment. The characters have packed their belongings, ready to leave the city and move to the suburbs with their newly adopted infant twins. The script called for the group to leave their keys on the kitchen counter. Rachel suggests they go get one last cup of coffee. The final line of the entire series was given to Matthew Perry. "Sure, Chandler says, pausing perfectly. Where? It was a brilliant classic Chandler Bing deflection, a final sarcastic joke to break the heavy emotional tension of the moment. The director called cut for the last time. The studio audience erupted into a standing ovation. The cast collapsed into each other's arms, weeping uncontrollably. The 10-year corporate marathon was officially over, but the Hollywood machine is cold and brutally efficient. Within hours of the final wrap party, the set dressers moved into stage 24. They stripped the paint, tore down the walls of Monica's apartment, and dismantled the Central Perk coffee shop. The studio space was immediately repurposed for the next pilot, the next cast of young, hopeful actors ready to be fed into the broadcasting engine. The network executives tallied their record-breaking profits, syndicated the episodes for billions of dollars, and moved on. They left the human beings who had generated that wealth to navigate the aftermath entirely on their own. For Courtney Cox, the transition was a return to the disciplined, structured professionalism she had always maintained. She moved on to star in other successful television series, started a production company, and continued to build a stable, thriving life. She had survived the pressure cooker of the 1990s, with her sanity and her health intact. For Matthew Perry, the absence of the studio structure was devastating. The Hollywood industry, which had ruthlessly exploited his illness while he was useful, offered absolutely no safety net once his contract expired. He was left alone with his massive fortune, a globally recognized face, and a highly traumatized biological system. The ensuing decades of his life were a testament to the unforgiving, lifelong nature of severe addiction. He did not experience a fairy tale Hollywood ending. He fought a valiant, brutal, and highly public war against his own demons. He spent millions of dollars on rehabilitation centers, sober living facilities, and medical interventions. He dedicated a massive portion of his later life to helping other addicts, transforming his former Malibu mansion into a sober living facility, and speaking candidly about his struggles to remove the stigma surrounding the disease. He wrote a brutally honest memoir, deliberately exposing the ugliest parts of his life in the desperate hope that his survival could help someone else avoid the same fate. But the physical damage inflicted upon his body during the peak years of his television fame was irreversible. The human heart and internal organs cannot endure decades of severe chemical assault without consequence. In October 2023, the world was shocked by the tragic news of his sudden death at the age of 54. The media reacted with predictable, superficial sentimentality. Networks aired highlight reels of Chandler Bing's funniest moments. Tabloids resurrected the old photographs of his weight fluctuations. But amidst the noise of the global mourning, the most profound and heartbreaking tribute came from the woman who had stood beside him through the darkest chapters of his life. Courtney Cox posted a brief, behind-the-scenes outtake from the exact moment they had filmed the London hotel room scene years earlier. In her statement, she did not speak about the ratings, the money, or the corporate success of the show. She spoke about his brilliant comedic mind, his vulnerability, and the deep, abiding love she held for him. She was the one who truly knew the cost of his performance. She was the one who had felt his hands shaking on the soundstage, who had looked into his hollow eyes and guided him back to reality. Her grief was the quiet, devastating grief of a soldier who had lost the person they had shared a trench with for 10 years. The story of Monica and Chandler is universally celebrated as a triumph of television writing, a perfect synthesis of comedy and romance that continues to comfort millions of viewers around the world. But the actual human history behind that romance is a stark, damning indictment of the entertainment industry. The Hollywood studio system operated with absolute clinical ruthlessness. They recognized a highly lucrative storyline, manufactured the perfect illusion of love, and systematically monetized the trauma of a severely ill man. They forced Matthew Perry to perform joy while his body was shutting down, prioritizing advertising contracts and production schedules over his basic biological survival. They built an empire on his punchlines and immediately turned a blind eye to the agony required to deliver them. Yet, within the toxic, crushing environment of that corporate machine, a genuine miracle of human connection occurred. The incredible chemistry audiences witnessed on screen was not the result of brilliant acting or clever direction. It was the raw, unvarnished reality of two people relying heavily on each other to survive an impossible situation. Matthew Perry brought a profound, broken vulnerability to the character that made Chandler Bing universally beloved. But he only survived those tapings because Courtney Cox refused to let him fall. She stepped into the void left by a negligent studio, quietly assuming the immense burden of carrying his performance, protecting his dignity, and keeping him tethered to the earth when he was actively slipping away. The true legacy of this iconic television pairing is not the jokes, the ratings, or the syndication billions. It is a testament to the fragile beauty of human loyalty operating in the shadow of corporate exploitation. It proves that while an industry will gladly wring every last laugh out of a dying man to satisfy the bottom line, the quiet, unseen heroism of a friend holding you together in the dark is the only thing that actually endures.